Hello, my dears, and welcome back to Strange Playgrounds. Now, I've been thinking a lot recently about a particular dynamic in storytelling, a particular idea that always obsesses me. It's one of those concepts that occurs again and again and again, or recurs, I suppose, in the fiction that I enjoy, and is such a various concept. It's one that can be deployed in so many different ways and to explore so many different ideas. It's something I adore. It's something carried over from the fiction I used to enjoy as a child. A lot of children's fiction focuses or centers around this very dynamic, and a lot of the fiction I enjoy as an adult takes those concerns of childhood and elaborates them and makes it projects them into an adult setting, and explores how they're actually far more complex and dark and deviant and transgressive than they even than when they occur to children or in children's fiction. It's the notion of stepping from a waking reality into a fantasy realm or into a dream realm, a realm that is not strictly real, or that is another order of reality entirely. It's a classic motif. It's a classic concept. It is the fulcrum around which so much fantasy fiction turns. But it's very difficult to do well. It's very difficult to do well. It began for me, as I imagine it began for a lot of people, certainly of my generation and of generations prior, with the Chronicles of Narnia. I imagine when a lot of people think of this concept, they immediately picture a very large wooden wardrobe and an infinite darkness within that then starts, instead of sprouting coats and shirts, starts to sprout pine branches and snow and trees and whatnot. It's a wonderful image actually that Lewis creates. Whatever else you might think of his fiction, believe me, my reactions to it are complex. They're very complex. It's a wonderful notion and a wonderful image. There is this sequence in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe where Lucy in particular starts walking. This is before she's even been to Narnia, before she even knows there's anything abstruse happening in this house, where she starts to press her way back through the darkness of the wardrobe, through the layers of fur coats and whatnot, and she starts to feel snow underfoot, and she starts to feel branches brushing past her, and suddenly she emerges between these two trees into the lamplight of Narnia. It's very peculiar, very strange, and I imagine for many children it may have been the first time they experienced that. And it is a wonderful moment. It's the ultimate transgression in many respects. You are stepping from one world to another. You are spanning not even light years or billions of light years, but untold distances in a step. It's wonderful. It is an absolutely wonderful notion. And in the case of the Chronicles of Narnia, the world that she steps into is one of human fantasy to a very real degree. It's one comprised of many and various different mythologies and mythological creatures and magic and all sorts of things. It's what many people would regard as escapist in that regard, but that's actually not true at all. And it's a popular misconception that occurs because of the dynamic of the fiction, i.e. you are literally escaping the world that you're born to. But actually that's not true. It's not true of the Chronicles of Narnia. It's not true of any fiction. It's not true of any fiction. It cannot be escapist in the way that people take it to mean. I.e., when people use the term escapist, they seem to think that it means distracting from reality, distracting from the day-to-day drudgery or banality of reality, or the miseries of reality. No fiction does that. No fiction does that. It's not possible. All fiction resonates or chimes with the cultural context in which it is produced and which it is read, it is actually impossible to divorce it from those factors. If you could do that, you'd get something that's entirely alien and frictionless, that would have no resonance, that would have it would have no engagement for you. There would be no association. It's entirely impossible, no matter how abstruse this world is or how removed the worlds created are. I mean, Tolkien claimed quite famously that he tried to write the Lord of the Rings shared of allegory, and it's just not. It's just not. Of course it isn't. It's a vehicle for languages that Tolkien created that were themselves informed by lots of dead languages, sort of ancient Celtic and Nordic languages from across the face of Europe, and indeed as repositories for the mythologies that he felt were being lost over time, which themselves were ancient and informed by actually existing oral traditions and mythologies. So it's actually impossible. It is totally impossible. But the nature of the dynamic of fiction, where you cross from one world to another, is very easy to interpret in that way. In the case of the Chronicles of Narnia, of course, within the story it's not true. Within The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe it's not true, because through their engagement with the fantasy world, Edmund, Peter, Susan and Lucy learn things about themselves. They actually explore things about themselves and their own concerns, and the concerns that are happening back home, bearing in mind that they are refugees. They are escaping the World War II. They have been actually sent out into the country from London so that they're not bombed, and then they are forced to engage in a war, and to fight in a war, even in Narnia. So they're even within the bounds of the story. They are not escaping the world that they come from. They are learning to cope with aspects of it, for better or worse. However you might interpret that, for my money, I think it fairly revolting that a being like Aslan, who is omnipresent and omniscient and insanely powerful and influential, summons innocents and children from another reality to fight his wars for him, when he could just basically doesn't even have to click his fingers, doesn't even have to stamp his paws, and he can just make the problem go away if he wanted to. But that's a discussion for another time. Or is it? I mean, that kind of character, the Aslan, Gandalf, Doctor character, they are the sort of sage that guides the more ignorant or innocent characters along their journey, is a classic archetype from this kind of fiction. They occur all the time, and they're wankers. I apologise, but they are always portrayed as being these quite kindly, quite wise sages, when in actual fact they are often the villains of the piece. And I don't mean in terms of the story; they are not the antagonists, but they are often these very powerful, very influential characters who could do better themselves, but who then they gang press innocent parties into doing their dirty work for them, putting them in incredible danger in the process. I mean, in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, Edmund is effectively killed at the end. He is resurrected, of course. There's a Deus Ex Machina that allows him to be resurrected, but he's put in phenomenal danger. They all are. They all are, for the sake of this omniscient, omnipresent character who could just end the situation without putting them in danger. Okay, within the context of the story, it's kind of a hero's journey. You know, it's the coming of age story. They learn about themselves. You have Peter becoming High King, earning his spurs, as it were, when he kills Fenris Ulf, the wolf, when he faces down the witch herself at one point. It's about the characters growing up, literally, in the case of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, and quite perversely, I find, because they grow up within Narnia. They actually become adults within Narnia. They occupy the thrones of Cair Paravel. They become the kings and queens of Narnia. And that's really rather interesting in and of itself, is it not? Because they are siblings. They're siblings, and yet they are the kings and queens of Cair Paravel. And very often, kings and queens are not... They are not kings and queens to be siblings. They're kings and queens to procreate, and carry on the line. So I don't know. You could infer some very perverse stuff in this story. You really can. So they grow up to be adults in Narnia and experience all the drives and complexities of being adults, and then are led back to the waking world where they become children again. They emerge from the wardrobe as children again. And that's highly problematic, is it not? Especially if they remember. if they remember what happened in Narnia. So you've got these characters wandering around in the bodies of children, but who are effectively psychologically adults. It's really problematic. And I would actually love to see someone, I would love to do it myself actually, write the story where they can't cope, where they've emerged from this, first of all, from this world that's spectacular in comparison to the comparatively rather grey and dismal world that they've come from, which is beset by war, where people are dying needlessly. But also into states where they're no longer kings and queens, where they're no longer adults, where they no longer have agency or power. They are now innocents again. They are now ignorant and powerless again. That must be terrible. That must do a real job on your state of mind. Yeah, very interesting to explore. But again, this is something that happens quite a lot in these stories. It happens quite a lot in these stories where a character steps from this world into another. You do often have this revolutionary aspect where they will experience in that world, in the fantasy plane, in the dreamscape, I suppose, in the mythological plane, they will earn their spurs, they will come of age, they will learn to be an adult or to fulfill whatever destiny they have for themselves, and then they'll come back. And they'll come back as different people. And they will be able to face the problems here that they couldn't face before. In fact, this recurs again in the Chronicles of Narnia. It recurs again and again and again. You have it originally with Polly and Diggory from the first book, The Magician's Nephew. This is exactly what happens to them. They learn in Narnia how to face down their demons and how to cope with things in the waking world and to change their state of being. It's also true in The Silver Chair. Of course, the Silver Chair, which has a new set of children, technically Eustace and Jill Pole, who are at a hideous boarding school where they're being chased and bullied and harassed. And they go to Narnia, they face down terrible things, they have amazing experiences, they suffer, they have privation, they have to prove themselves, and then they come back and they can face down the bullies, because they're not, as Aslan himself says to them, you are facing children, not warriors. They've experienced lots worse. So there's that element. There's sort of the psychological element. There's the coming of age element. But it's also, it can be very dull. It can be very prescribed. That dynamic. It happens a lot like that. It happens a hell of a lot like that. Very often you get the awful thing happening where they forget, where the characters who go to these dreaming worlds forget. And so they return to a state of innocence, and so it makes the stories pointless. I really hate that. I actually loathe that. It's as bad as making it all a dream for me. I mean, some of the better stories actually explore that very concept of forgetting the fantasy world, and of course how it's impossible, and of how it drives you mad slowly. I mean, Weaveworld does it. It actually includes that element in the story. But the best ones, the better ones, they demonstrate how, first of all, notions of reality are broken apart by the mere existence of another world or of another reality. The notion of what is real and what is not is broken apart and thrown into question. Some of the more deviant ones dare to suggest that, yeah, fuck it, why not? Why not use the mechanism of stepping from this world into another as a means of breaking those seams apart, of ripping them wide, of wounding the world fundamentally, and allowing the two to bleed into one another? It's better than what we've got, it dares to suggest. And in that regard, you have an interplay between the real and the actual, and the imaginary and the mythological. The unlikely, the absurd, the abstruse becomes another form of reality. It happens in Clive Barker's Books of the Art. Those are stories about doing exactly that, about ripping open a way into the dreaming life of reality, of humanity. It's about finding a means, through obsession of all things, through one's obsessions, of tearing the world apart, of fundamentally wounding it, and of undoing the veil of reality. What Barker dares to suggest in that story is that what we presume of the waking world, what we absurdly call reality is nothing. It's a flimsy curtain that can be drawn aside, and there is a more fundamental reality waiting beyond. What the books of the art also do, which is very clever, is they establish this wonderful ambiguity. The world or the state of being beyond this one, beyond the painted curtain of this one, is neither actual and literal or entirely abstract and metaphysical. It's both. It's a state of being that is reflective of the dreaming life, not only of humanity, but of all sentient species, and is therefore infinite. It's a sea. It's a vast sea called quiddity, and you have the islands called the ephemeris, which dot it, and each island is a reality. It's a waking reality. So by tearing open the veil, you are able to step through into your own dreaming life in all of its complexity and ambiguity. This is what happens, I find, when people who've read Chronicles of Narnia and its ilk as a child grow up and start writing themselves. They start to transpose the concerns of or rather, they start to transpose the dynamics of the fiction they read and the devices of the fiction that they read onto adult concerns, and they make it more ambiguous, more complex, more interesting, and it can work beautifully. It can work absolutely beautifully. Don't get me wrong, in the books of the art, it is massively ambiguous. It's massively ambiguous because it's not just the wonderful and positive stuff of humanity that exists beyond the veil. Of course not. It's everything, in all of its horror, in all of its banality, in all of its corrosive qualities. There is true horror waiting beyond quiddity, on the far end of quiddity, which because the way has been ripped open, can now spill through into the waking. There's the notion of the Iad Ouroboros, which they seem to be everything negative in humanity made manifest. It's very difficult to pin down what they are, or specifically what they are, and it would probably be a mistake to do so. They're presented in this very abstract way. Even the way Barker visualizes them is highly abstract, but they evoke negativity by their very presence. They arouse every horrendous, negative, banal, defeated thing in the heart of humanity, because that's what they are. They're all of our negativity coalesced and made into a kind of species, I suppose, into a kind of swarm, a kind of entity, and it's quite horrific. It's quite horrific. So yes, there are ambiguities here, and it's all bound up with this notion of becoming abstracts of ourselves, of becoming idealizations of ourselves through our obsessions. It's so clever. I would recommend the books of the art mightily. So I would. Neil Gaiman does it a lot too. Neil Gaiman does it a lot in his fiction, where there are secret realities that are linked to ours. They are fundamentally bound to ours and are just parts of it in many respects, but which can be accessed from it under certain circumstances and by certain individuals. Neverwhere does this. Neverwhere is a wonderful book that suggests that there is a secret world that operates it operates underneath London. It's London underground, and it is this bizarre, fantastical world where there are demons and angels and vampires and all sorts of things, and where you can literally step through, or you can get lost there if you happen to become lost yourself. It's a realm of the lost things that operate between the cracks of reality. It's a dreaming space. It's a dreaming space that's one step removed from reality and is therefore highly redolent of it. It's a much more real fantasy world in terms of its psychology and its grittiness and its ambiguity than Narnia is, for example, which is a children's fantasy and is therefore morally absolute, and it deals with much more iconic fantasy subjects and archetypes and creatures and whatnot. It's this notion of stepping through, of wounding reality or of ripping it open. It is something that resonates with me on a very powerful level, and likely because of that input as a child. Again, a lot of my cartoons dealt with it as well. A lot of my input as a child dealt with it. I remember the Rankin Bass Flight of Dragons, for example, which is an animated cartoon which is stunning. It's really, really good. If it's one of those things where I loved it as a child. I adored it as a child. It's part of the fundamental input of my childhood and of my imagination. One of the first stories I really connected to and really engaged with. But when I go back to watch it now, it's not like much of the input of childhood, which just doesn't pass muster. It just doesn't stand up. It's actually a stunning bit of work. It's a stunning bit of work. The animation, yeah, it's a bit ropey at times, but it's actually so stylized and so weird and so unusual in that very Rankin Bass way that it works. It just works as a piece of art in and of itself. But it's also gloriously complex in terms of the ideas it includes. You have this notion of the realm of human imagination and of mythology is a literal place. Or rather, it's a collection of literal places that are ruled over by these magicians that are not necessarily magicians. They're more like demigods, and they each preside over an aspect of these realms. So you have Carolinus, who's the green wizard, who's he presides over nature and over forests and woodland and hills and whatnot. You have Lotajal, who is the yellow wizard, who presides over light and air. He is transcendence and healing and contemplation. You have Solarius, who is the blue wizard, whose realm is enlightenment and is the heights and the depths, the deepest ocean, the highest mountain, its extremes, its space, its intellectualism and science and exploration. And then you have the red wizard, who is everything negative, Omadan, brilliantly played by James Earl Jones, who is everything negative. He is evil. He is like elemental evil and negativity, dirt, filth, suffering. He's brilliant. He's absolutely brilliant. And into this world, or rather counterpointed to this world, you have the world of humanity, which is dark and dirty, and it involves a character named Peter Dickinson, who is the original writer of the book Dungeons and Dragons, bizarrely. Stepping into this world that he half created, half imagined, and is half a product of. He is as Carolinus himself puts it, he's a man with one foot in the realm of science and one in the realm of magic. He is a scientist, he's a biologist, he's a student of biology, and yet he's also fascinated by things like dragons and magic and wizards. It's like Peter Dickinson himself. It's really cool. You have this. It's one of the rare children's stories that involves this dynamic that dares to broach the complexities of it. So it is not the case that Peter steps into this fantasy world and is immediately a part of it. Oh, no, 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 no. He brings his science with him and starts to help. He starts to help out. He actually starts to solve problems in this world using his science. And it's a very clever exploration of how these two realities that he operates in simultaneously mesh and are necessary to one another, the realm of imagination and the realm of science and rationality, but also conflict at times when one becomes aggressive over the other, or when one overtakes the other. And it does end with him having perhaps in a contentious manner, it does end with him having to reject the realm of fantasy to a certain degree and wake to reality. It's a harsh fucking lesson. It really is. It's a kind of a dark ending in many respects. He has to do it. He has to do it to save, ironically, to save the realm of imagination, but also to save waking reality. He has to, and it's a dark thing. It's a growing up story. It's a much more complex version of the growing up story, where you do have to put aside one's literal belief in these things and start to take them for what they are, which is they operate in the realm of the abstract, in the realm of the imagination, of the metaphor, and are as real and as important in that regard as anything. They don't need to be literally true to have meaning. That's the point. That's the point. But one must also have a care of allowing fantastical imagination to have too much influence over rationality and reason and the realm of the real. It's very clever. It's very clever. It simultaneously acknowledges the necessity of this interplay. So it's not the case that the two realms are entirely separate. They mesh and they inform one another. It's about maintaining balance. It's about maintaining a balance of the two. It's really bloody clever, especially considering it was aimed at children. It does arguably the same thing as The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, but does so in a much more clever and ambiguous way. It's really beautiful. I mean, genuinely beautiful, clever, brilliant, witty, lampoons a lot of fantasy tropes and concepts. Very, very clever. If you haven't seen it, go and watch it. It's actually really good and surprisingly dark. Surprisingly dark. There are some images in it that are really, really dark and distressing for a children's story. It doesn't really pull its punches in that regard. When there's evil, and it's elemental, and it's dark and wicked and cruel, and it harms people, it hurts people, it kills people, you know? It's sad, it's emotional, it's very deviant for the kind of story that it is. Well worth a look. Well worth a look. Not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but it does exemplify the kind of input that I had as a child, and that incorporates this dynamic of stepping from one reality into another. It's something I love. It's something I love, but I love it when it's ambiguous. I love it when it dares to explore that notion in all of its implications, as dark and as cruel and as problematic as they can be. So yeah, it's a fascinating one. It's an absolutely fascinating one. Until next time, ladies and gents, bye-bye!